The streets were quiet that late afternoon, the kind of stillness that comes before the city transitions into the hum of evening life. But amidst the calm, a lone figure moved slowly, almost painfully down the cracked pavement. It was Max, an old German shepherd, his once proud frame now thin and weathered. His fur, once a rich sable and black, was matted with dirt, and his ribs were visible beneath his skin. Every step he took seemed to cost him great effort, his legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion. Yet despite his frailty, Max pressed on, his determination unwavering. Clutched tightly in his cracked, worn jaws was a small, battered doll. The doll, with its faded yellow dress and missing button eye, looked as though it had been carried for miles. Its fabric was streaked with grime, and its once bright colors had dulled to a muted shadow of what they once were. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a random object, something a stray dog had picked up along the way. But to Max, it was more than that. It was a lifeline, a purpose, the reason he had kept moving despite the odds stacked against him. As Max trudged forward, his presence began to draw attention. A few passers-by stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pity. "Poor thing," muttered an elderly woman named Mrs. Tucker, who lived in the apartments across the street. She clutched her shopping bag tightly as she observed the dog. "He looks like he hasn't eaten in days." Her neighbor Ron nodded in agreement. "What's he doing with that doll?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "It's like he's protecting it." A young woman, moved by the sight of the struggling dog, hurried into a nearby convenience store and returned with a can of dog food and a small bowl of water. She approached Max cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle him. "Here, boy," she said softly, setting the food and water down a few feet away. But Max didn't stop. He didn't even glance at the offering. Instead, he tightened his grip on the doll and continued his slow, labored march forward. The woman frowned, half amused and half concerned. "He's determined, isn't he?" she murmured. Max's destination was clear, at least to him. His tired eyes were fixed on a gray brick building at the end of the block, the local police station. It wasn't far now, just a few more steps. The crowd that had gathered to watch him began to follow at a distance, their curiosity piqued by the dog's strange behavior. Whispers rippled through the group. "Where's he going? Why won't he let go of that doll? Should we call someone?" Max didn't hear them, or if he did, he didn't care. His world had narrowed to a single goal, reaching the police station. Each step felt like a monumental effort, his legs trembling more violently with every movement. The doll's dirty yellow dress flopped with each labored step, but Max held it firmly, carefully, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. His breathing was ragged, his ribs heaving with the strain, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Max reached the threshold of the police station. The gray facade loomed above him, its doors just a few feet away. He hesitated for a moment, swaying on his paws as though his body might give out at any second. Then, with the last ounce of strength he had left, Max staggered forward and collapsed in the doorway. His body lay still, his sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. But even in his exhaustion, his jaws remained clenched around the doll, refusing to let it go. Inside the station, Officer Clark was seated at his desk, filling out paperwork. The day had been uneventful so far, the kind of slow shift that made him long for the end of his shift. But the commotion outside caught his attention. He heard the murmurs of the crowd, the shuffling of feet, and then the soft thud of something or someone collapsing just outside the door. Frowning, he stood and made his way to the entrance. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, lying in the doorway, was Max. The dog was a pitiful sight, thin, dirty, and clearly on the brink of collapse. Clark's eyes were immediately drawn to the doll in Max's mouth. It was such an odd detail, so out of place that it made him pause. "What in the world?" he muttered under his breath. Kneeling down, Clark reached out a hand toward Max. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice gentle. "What happened to you?" Max's eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment they locked onto Clark's. There was something in those eyes, something desperate, something pleading. It wasn't the look of a stray dog begging for food or shelter. It was something deeper, something that sent a chill down Clark's spine. "Get some water," Clark called over his shoulder to another officer. Carefully, he slid his arms under Max's frail body, lifting him as gently as he could. Max didn't resist. He was too weak to do anything but lie there, his body limp in Clark's arms. But even as Clark carried him inside, Max's jaws remained locked around the doll. Clark placed Max on an old wool blanket in the corner of the station, where the dog lay motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest. Another officer brought over a bowl of water, which Clark set down in front of Max. "Here you go, boy," he said, his tone soothing. "Drink up. You've earned it." Max hesitated for a moment before finally releasing the doll, setting it down carefully beside him. He lapped at the water, his movements slow and deliberate, pausing every few seconds to glance at the doll as though ensuring it was still there. Clark watched him, a frown creasing his brow. There was something about this dog, something that didn't add up. Why had he come here? And why was he so fixated on that doll? It wasn't just a random object, Clark could see that much. It meant something to Max. But what? As Max finished drinking, he lifted his head and looked at Clark again. This time his gaze was more focused, more intense. He let out a low, soft whine, his eyes darting toward the bulletin board on the far wall. Clark followed his gaze, his frown deepening. The board was covered in photographs and notices, missing persons, wanted criminals, community alerts. Max whined again, louder this time, and nudged the doll with his nose. Clark's stomach tightened. He didn't know why, but he had the distinct feeling that this dog was trying to tell him something important. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to Max. "Let's see what you've got to say." As he stood and walked toward the bulletin board, Max's eyes followed him, unblinking. Clark scanned the photographs, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't quite explain. And then he saw it, a picture of a little girl with soft brown curls and a bright smile. Her name was printed below the photo, Alice Harper, missing for 2 weeks. Clark turned back to Max, who was now staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. The doll, the determination, the desperation, it all began to make sense. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was a messenger. And whatever message Max had brought, Clark knew it was only the beginning. The police station was unusually quiet that evening, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the stillness as Officer Clark sat at his desk, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the corner where Max lay. The old German shepherd had been given water and a small meal, but he barely touched the food. Instead, Max lay on the wool blanket, his body still trembling slightly from exhaustion. His eyes, however, remained sharp, darting around the room as if he were trying to make sense of his surroundings. And then there was the doll, still clutched tightly in his jaws, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Clark leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. He had seen plenty of stray dogs in his years on the force, but there was something different about Max. The way he had dragged himself to the station, the determination in his eyes, and now his refusal to let go of the doll, it all felt deliberate, purposeful. Clark couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't just another stray. He was here for a reason. "Why won't you let go of that thing, huh?" Clark muttered, more to himself than to Max. He stood and walked over to the dog, crouching down beside him. "What's so special about it?" Max's ears twitched at the sound of Clark's voice, but he didn't move. His jaws remained locked around the doll, his eyes flicking up to meet Clark's for a brief moment. There was something in that gaze, something almost human. It wasn't fear or aggression. It was urgency. Clark felt a chill run down his spine. "Okay, buddy," Clark said softly, reaching out a hand. "Let me see it." He moved slowly, not wanting to startle the dog. But as soon as his fingers brushed against the doll, Max growled, a low, guttural sound that made Clark freeze. The growl wasn't threatening, but it was clear. Max wasn't ready to let go. Clark pulled his hand back, raising his palms in a gesture of surrender. All right, you win," he said, standing up. "But you've got to give me something to work with here." Max's growl faded, and he rested his head on his paws, the doll still firmly in his grip. Clark sighed and returned to his desk, his mind racing. There was something about that doll. It wasn't just a random object Max had picked up. It meant something to him. But what? As the hours passed, Max began to relax. His breathing steadied, and the trembling in his legs subsided. Clark watched him closely, noting every small movement. Eventually, Max shifted, releasing the doll from his jaws and placing it carefully on the blanket in front of him. He nudged it with his nose, almost as if he were checking to make sure it was still there. Then, for the first time since he arrived, Max let out a soft bark. Clark's head snapped up. The bark wasn't loud, but it was insistent. Max's eyes were fixed on something across the room, Clark followed his gaze and saw the bulletin board on the far wall. It was covered in photographs and notices: missing persons, wanted criminals, community alerts. Max barked again, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Clark said, standing up. He walked over to the bulletin board, his eyes scanning the photos. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" Max let out another bark, louder this time, and struggled to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he managed to stand. He took a shaky step forward, his eyes never leaving the board. Clark watched in astonishment as Max raised a paw, clawing at the air as though trying to point at something. All right, Clark said, his heart pounding. "Let me take a closer look." He moved closer to the board, his eyes flicking over the photographs. There were dozens of faces staring back at him, men, women, children, all missing. Clark's stomach tightened as he scanned the images, searching for something, anything, that might explain Max's behavior. And then he saw it. In the center of the board was a photograph of a little girl. She had soft brown curls and a bright, innocent smile. Her name was printed below the photo: Alice Harper, missing for 2 weeks. Clark's breath caught in his throat. He turned back to Max, who was now sitting, his eyes locked on the photograph. The dog let out a low whine, his gaze flicking between Clark and the picture of Alice. It was as if he were pleading with Clark to understand. Clark stepped closer to the board, his eyes narrowing as he studied the photograph. Alice was holding something in her hands, a doll. It was small, with a yellow dress and a missing button eye. Clark's heart skipped a beat. It was the same doll Max had brought with him. "This can't be a coincidence," Clark muttered, his mind racing. He turned back to Max, who was now lying down again, his head resting on his paws. The doll was still in front of him, its faded fabric a stark contrast against the dark wool blanket. Clark crouched down beside the dog, his voice soft. "Where did you get this, huh? Did it belong to her?" Max didn't respond, of course, but his eyes said enough. There was a sadness in them, a weight that Clark couldn't ignore. This dog knew something. He was sure of it. Clark picked up the doll, turning it over in his hands. The fabric was worn, the seams frayed, but it was unmistakable. This was Alice's doll, the same one she was holding in the photograph. But how had it ended up with Max, and why had he brought it here? Questions swirled in Clark's mind, each one more unsettling than the last. He looked back at the photograph of Alice, her bright smile now haunting in its stillness. She had been missing for 2 weeks. No leads, no witnesses, no sign of where she might have gone. And now, out of nowhere, this dog had shown up with her doll. Clark stood, his jaw tightening. He didn't believe in coincidences. Max had come here for a reason. He was trying to tell them something, and Clark was determined to figure out what it was. He turned to one of the other officers in the station. "Get me everything we have on the Alice Harper case," he said, his voice firm. "I want to know every detail." The officer nodded and hurried off, leaving Clark alone with Max. He looked down at the dog, who was now watching him with those same intense eyes. Clark felt a strange sense of connection, as though Max understood more than he let on. "All right, buddy," Clark said quietly. "You've got my attention. Let's figure this out together." Max let out a soft huff, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. It was as if he knew Clark was finally starting to understand. The mystery of the doll was far from solved, but one thing was clear. Max wasn't just a stray dog, he was a messenger. And whatever message he had brought, it was only the beginning. The night air was cool and heavy, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. Officer Clark stood in the dimly lit police station, his eyes fixed on Max. The old German shepherd had been restless ever since Clark had taken notice of the doll and the photograph of Alice Harper. Max's behavior was unlike anything Clark had ever seen in a dog. It wasn't random or instinctual, it was deliberate, purposeful. Max wasn't just a stray, he was trying to lead them somewhere. Clark crouched down beside Max, who was now pacing in small, uneven circles, his tail low but wagging slightly. The dog's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Clark as if urging him to follow. "You want me to go with you, don't you?" Clark murmured, his voice low. Max let out a soft bark, his ears perking up at the sound of Clark's voice. It was all the confirmation Clark needed. "All right, buddy," Clark said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "Let's see where you're trying to take me." Max's body seemed to come alive with a renewed energy, despite the exhaustion that had weighed him down earlier. His legs still trembled slightly, but his determination was unmistakable. Clark opened the station door and Max bolted forward, his nose to the ground, sniffing the air as if following an invisible trail. Clark followed close behind, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his sidearm. He didn't know what to expect, but his gut told him this wasn't going to be a simple walk. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Max moved with purpose, his pace steady but urgent. Clark quickened his steps to keep up, his eyes scanning the surroundings. They passed through residential neighborhoods, the warm glow of lights in windows a stark contrast to the cold, empty streets. As they moved farther from the station, the houses became fewer, replaced by abandoned buildings and overgrown lots. "Where are you taking me?" Clark muttered under his breath visible in the cool night air. Max didn't respond, of course, but his body language was clear. He was on a mission. The journey took them deeper into the city's forgotten corners, through narrow alleys and darkened streets that Clark wouldn't have ventured into alone. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Max paused occasionally, sniffing the ground or the air before continuing on. Each time he stopped, Clark felt a pang of unease, as though they were being watched. But when he looked around, there was nothing, just the empty streets and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, Max led Clark to a desolate area on the outskirts of town. The buildings here were old and crumbling, their windows boarded up and their walls covered in graffiti. The streetlights were sparse, their dim glow barely illuminating the cracked pavement. Max slowed as they approached a large, decrepit warehouse. The structure loomed in the darkness, its silhouette jagged and foreboding against the night sky. Clark stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. The warehouse was massive, its metal siding rusted and its roof sagging in places. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, though parts of it had been torn down, leaving gaping holes. The air here was different, thicker, colder, and filled with a sense of unease that made the hairs on the back of Clark's neck stand on end. Max barked, breaking the silence. The sound echoed off the walls of the warehouse, sharp and insistent. He turned to look at Clark, his eyes wide and urgent before barking again. It was clear he wanted Clark to follow him inside. Clark hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. There was something about this place that felt wrong, as if it were hiding secrets that didn't want to be uncovered. He reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. "This is Officer Clark," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "I'm at an abandoned warehouse on the east side of town, requesting backup. Possible connection to the Alice Harper case." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Copy that, Clark. Units are en route. ETA 10 minutes. Clark clipped the radio back to his belt and turned his attention to Max, who was now pacing near the entrance to the warehouse. The dog's barks had turned into low, anxious whines, his body language tense and alert. Clark took a deep breath, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "All right, Max," he said quietly. "Let's see what's inside." The gate to the fence was already ajar, its hinges rusted and creaking as Clark pushed it open. Max slipped through first, his nose to the ground as he sniffed the path ahead. Clark followed, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. The closer they got to the warehouse, the stronger the sense of foreboding became. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. Max led Clark to a side entrance where a metal door hung slightly open, its edges warped and jagged. The dog paused, his ears swiveling as he listened for any sounds from within. Clark did the same, his hand tightening on his gun. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. Max barked again, a sharp, urgent sound that made Clark's heart race. The dog stepped forward, nudging the door open with his nose. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the empty space beyond. Clark hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to wait for backup. But Max's urgency was contagious, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence. "Stay close, Max," Clark said, his voice low. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior of the warehouse was just as decrepit as the exterior. The air was damp and cold, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, rusted tools, and scraps of metal. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, the words and images faded with time. Max moved ahead, his nose to the ground as he sniffed the air. He paused near a stack of crates, his body tense and his ears perked. Clark followed, his flashlight sweeping over the area. There was nothing unusual at first glance, but Max's behavior told him otherwise. The dog let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on a dark corner of the room. Clark's grip on his gun tightened as he approached the crates. His flashlight revealed a narrow gap between them, just wide enough for someone to slip through. He crouched down, peering into the darkness beyond. The faint scent of something metallic, blood perhaps, wafted through the air, making his stomach churn. "Max, what is it?" Clark whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog didn't respond, but his growl deepened, his body rigid with tension. Clark's radio crackled to life, the voice of another officer breaking the silence. "Clark, backup is here. We're outside the warehouse." Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of urgency. Whatever was inside this warehouse, Max had led him here for a reason, and Clark was determined to find out what it was. "Over here," Clark called into the radio, his voice steady. "I think we found something." As the sound of footsteps approached from outside, Clark turned his attention back to Max. The dog's eyes met his, filled with a mix of fear and determination. Clark nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's do this, Max," he said quietly. Together, they prepared to uncover the secrets hidden within the warehouse, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The air inside the warehouse was suffocating, thick with the stench of mildew and rust. The dim beam of Officer Clark's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the decaying interior. Behind him, the backup team moved cautiously, their own flashlights sweeping the room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of their boots on the dusty floor. Max, the old German shepherd, stayed close to Clark, his body tense and his ears perked. The dog's behavior was sharper now, more focused, as if he knew they were on the verge of uncovering something terrible. "Spread out," Clark ordered, his voice low but firm. "Check every corner. Look for anything unusual." The officers fanned out, their movements careful and deliberate. The warehouse was massive, its high ceilings and shadowy corners creating an eerie atmosphere. Broken furniture and rusted machinery were scattered across the floor. But it was the silence that unnerved Clark the most. It was too quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Max let out a low growl, his nose to the ground as he sniffed a trail invisible to the human eye. Clark followed him, his flashlight sweeping over the debris. The dog led him to a large metal door at the far end of the warehouse. It was slightly ajar, the hinges rusted and the edges warped. Max stopped in front of it, his growl deepening. He looked back at Clark, his eyes filled with urgency. Clark's stomach tightened. He gestured for two officers to join him. "On me," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. He pushed the door open, the metal groaning loudly in protest. The sound echoed through the warehouse, sending a shiver down his spine. Beyond the door was a dark, narrow hallway. The air was colder here, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. Blood. Clark's grip on his flashlight tightened as he stepped inside, Max staying close to his side. The hallway led to another door, this one heavier and reinforced with a padlock. The lock, however, had been broken, the chain hanging loosely from the handle. Clark exchanged a glance with the officers behind him. "Be ready," he said quietly. He pushed the door open, and the beam of his flashlight revealed a sight that made his blood run cold. The room was large but dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old, rusted bunk beds, their mattresses stained and torn. Scattered across the floor were toys, broken dolls, stuffed animals missing limbs, and small cars with chipped paint. There were also shoes, tiny and worn, and pieces of clothing that looked as though they had been hastily discarded. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and neglect. Clark's heart sank as he took in the scene. This wasn't just a warehouse. It had been used to hold children. The signs were unmistakable. He moved deeper into the room, his flashlight illuminating more of the horrifying details. There were drawings on the walls, crude sketches made with crayons, stick figures, houses, and suns. But there were also darker images, figures with angry faces, bars, and what looked like tears. "Jesus," one of the officers muttered behind him. "What the hell is this place?" Clark didn't answer. His attention was drawn to a pile of papers in the corner of the room. He crouched down, his flashlight revealing a stack of documents, passports, birth certificates, and photographs. He picked up one of the passports, his hands trembling slightly. The photo was of a young boy, no older than 6, his wide eyes staring back at him. The name on the passport was unfamiliar, but the realization hit Clark like a punch to the gut. These were the identities of missing children. "Get forensics in here," Clark said, his voice tight. "We need to document everything." As the officers began to secure the room, Max let out a sharp bark, drawing Clark's attention. The dog was standing near another door at the back of the room, his body rigid and his tail low. He barked again, his eyes fixed on the door. Clark's heart pounded in his chest. Max had led them this far, and he wasn't about to ignore the dog's instincts now. "Stay here and secure the area," Clark ordered the other officers. "I'm going with Max." The door led to a staircase, the steps descending into darkness. The air grew colder as Clark and Max made their way down, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the narrow space. The walls were damp, and the smell of mold was overpowering. Clark's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. At the bottom of the stairs was another door, this one made of heavy steel. It was slightly ajar, and from the other side came a faint sound, a muffled whimper. Clark's breath caught in his throat. He pushed the door open, his flashlight revealing a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with cages. Inside the cages were children, dirty, frightened, and huddled together for warmth. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Some of them clung to each other, while others stared blankly at the floor. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. Clark's flashlight swept over the room, his heart breaking with every detail. The children were malnourished, their clothes tattered, and their bodies covered in bruises. The air was filled with the sound of their soft cries and the faint rustle of movement as they shifted in their cages. And then he saw her. In the far corner of the room, a little girl sat clutching a doll. Her hair was matted, and her face was streaked with dirt, but there was no mistaking her. It was Alice Harper. She was alive. Clark's voice caught in his throat as he stepped closer. "Alice," he said softly, his flashlight illuminating her small frame. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the doll tighter, her tiny hands trembling. Max let out a soft whine and moved toward her, his tail wagging gently. Alice's eyes lit up when she saw the dog, and for the first time, her expression softened. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Clark felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the reunion. Max nuzzled Alice gently, his body language protective and comforting. The little girl buried her face in his fur, her small body shaking with silent sobs. "It's okay," Clark said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." He turned to his radio, his voice firm. "This is Clark. We found them. We found the children. Send medical and additional units immediately." As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Clark knelt beside Alice, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Max stayed by her side, his presence a source of comfort and strength. The horrors of the warehouse were far from over, but in that moment, Clark knew they had made a difference. Alice was safe, and Max had led them to her. The old German shepherd had done what no one else could. He had brought hope to a place filled with darkness. And as Clark looked into Max's tired but determined eyes, he knew one thing for certain. This dog was a hero. The scene at the warehouse was chaotic, a flurry of movement and noise as the police worked to secure the area and rescue the children. The once silent building was now alive with the sounds of officers shouting commands, the crackle of radios, and the soft cries of frightened children. Flashlights cut through the dim, musty air, illuminating the horrors that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. Officer Clark stood in the middle of it all, his heart pounding as he tried to process the enormity of what they had uncovered. The children, some as young as 3 or 4, were being carefully led out of the basement by officers and paramedics. Their small, fragile bodies were wrapped in blankets, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Many of them clung to the officers who carried them, their tiny hands gripping tightly as if afraid to let go. The sight was both heartbreaking and infuriating, a stark reminder of the cruelty that had brought them to this place. Clark's attention, however, was focused on one child in particular, Alice Harper. She was sitting on the cold, damp floor, her arms wrapped tightly around Max, the old German shepherd who had led them here. Her face was buried in his fur, her small body trembling as she clung to him like a lifeline. Max, despite his exhaustion, sat perfectly still, his head resting gently against hers. His tail wagged weakly, a small but unmistakable sign of relief. Clark crouched down beside them, his voice soft. "Alice," he said gently. The little girl lifted her head, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting his. For a moment she didn't say anything, her gaze flickering between Clark and Max. Then, without a word, she tightened her grip on the dog, as if afraid he might disappear. "It's okay," Clark said, his tone reassuring. "You're safe now. We're going to take you home." Alice nodded slowly, her fingers still tangled in Max's fur. "Max saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He found me." Clark felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the interaction between the girl and the dog. There was something almost magical about their bond, a connection that went beyond words. Max had done what no one else could. He had found Alice and brought her back. But how? How had this old, frail dog managed to track her down to lead them to this place? And why had he carried her doll with him, as if it were a clue? As Clark stood, his mind racing with questions, one of the other officers approached him. "We've got a few suspects in custody," the officer said, his voice grim. "They were hiding in one of the back rooms. Looks like they were running some kind of trafficking operation." Clark's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Make sure they don't go anywhere," he said. "I want to know everything. How long they've been operating, how many kids they've taken, and who else is involved." The officer nodded and walked away, leaving Clark alone with Alice and Max. He turned back to the little girl, his expression softening. "Alice," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened? How did you end up here?" Alice hesitated, her small hands clutching the doll that Max had brought with him. "They took me," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I was playing in the backyard with Max and then they grabbed me. Max tried to stop them, but they hurt him. They pushed him away." Clark's heart ached as he listened to her story. He could only imagine the fear and confusion she must have felt, being torn away from her home and her family. "And the doll?" he asked, nodding toward the toy in her hands. "How did Max get it?" Alice looked down at the doll, her fingers tracing its faded yellow dress. "I dropped it," she said softly. "When they took me, I dropped it. I thought I'd never see it again." Clark glanced at Max, who was now lying on the floor, his eyes half closed but still alert. Somehow the dog had found the doll and carried it with him, as if he knew it was the key to finding Alice. It was a detail that both amazed and baffled Clark. How had Max known? Was it instinct? Or something deeper, something that couldn't be explained? As the paramedics approached to check on Alice, Clark stepped back, giving them space to work. He watched as they gently examined her, their voices calm and soothing. Alice didn't let go of Max, even as they wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and offered her a bottle of water. The dog stayed by her side, his presence a source of comfort and security. Clark turned his attention to the rest of the scene. The other children were being loaded into ambulances, their small faces peeking out from beneath thick blankets. The officers were combing through the warehouse, collecting evidence and documenting everything they could. It was a grim but necessary process, one that would hopefully lead to justice for the children who had suffered here. But even as Clark focused on the task at hand, his thoughts kept drifting back to Max. The dog's journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. He had followed Alice's trail for days, maybe even weeks, through unknown terrain and countless obstacles. He had carried her doll as a symbol of hope, a message that he wouldn't stop until he found her. And in the end, he had succeeded. As the last of the children were taken to safety, Clark knelt down beside Max, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "You're a hero, you know that?" he said quietly. Max's tail thumped against the floor, a small but unmistakable sign of acknowledgement. Alice, now wrapped in a warm blanket and sitting on the back of an ambulance, called out to Clark. "Can Max come home with me?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Clark smiled, his heart swelling at the sight of her. "I think Max would like that," he said. "He's earned it." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicles began to pull away, Clark stood in the empty warehouse, the weight of the night's events settling over him. There were still so many questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. But one thing was clear. Max had done something extraordinary. He had brought Alice home. And as Clark watched the ambulance disappear into the distance, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the old German shepherd who had defied the odds and reminded them all of the power of loyalty, love, and determination. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a hero. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet neighborhood where the Harper family lived. Inside their modest home, the atmosphere was a mix of relief and overwhelming emotion. Alice Harper, The little girl who had been missing for 2 weeks was finally home. She sat on the living room couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, her small hands clutching the doll that had become a symbol of her survival. Her parents, Sarah and Michael Harper, sat on either side of her, their eyes red from tears of joy and sorrow. They couldn't stop holding her, as if afraid she might disappear again. Officer Clark stood near the doorway, watching the family's reunion with a bittersweet smile. It was moments like these that made his job worth it, even if the horrors he had witnessed in the warehouse still lingered in his mind. But as much as he wanted to focus on the joy of Alice's return, there was one question that wouldn't leave his mind. Max. The old German shepherd had been the key to finding Alice, but his story was still a mystery. How had he known where to go? Why had he been so determined to lead them to the warehouse? And most importantly, what was his connection to Alice? Clark cleared his throat gently, drawing the attention of Sarah and Michael. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice soft, "but I was hoping you could tell me more about Max. He's the reason we found Alice, and I think there's more to his story than we realize." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at Max, who was lying on the floor near Alice's feet. The dog's body was still thin and frail, but his eyes were alert, watching over Alice with a quiet intensity. "Max," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's our dog, or at least he was." Clark raised an eyebrow. "He was your dog?" Michael nodded, his expression somber. "We've had Max since he was a puppy. He's been with us for almost 10 years. He was Alice's best friend. They were inseparable." Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Alice used to call him her guardian angel. Wherever she went, Max was right there with her. He'd follow her to the backyard, to her room, even to the bus stop when she went to school. He was always watching over her." Clark glanced at Max, who was now resting his head on his paws, his eyes still fixed on Alice. "So what happened?" he asked. "How did he end up out there, alone?" Michael's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with Sarah. "It happened the day Alice was taken," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "We were in the backyard. Alice was playing with Max, like she always did. I went inside for just a minute to grab something, and when I came back..." His voice broke, and he looked away, unable to continue. Sarah picked up where he left off, her voice trembling. "When Michael came back, Alice was gone. Max was barking like crazy, running back and forth near the edge of the yard. We didn't understand what was happening at first. We thought maybe Alice had wandered off, but then we saw the broken fence. Someone had taken her." Clark felt a chill run down his spine. "And Max?" "Max tried to stop them," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "We found tufts of his fur near the fence, and there were scratches on the ground like he'd been in a fight. He must have tried to protect her, but whoever took Alice, they must have hurt him. When we called for him, he was gone too. We thought..." She paused, wiping her eyes. "We thought we'd lost them both." Michael took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists. "We searched everywhere for them. We called the police, put up flyers, did everything we could, but there was no sign of Alice or Max. It was like they'd vanished." Clark nodded slowly, piecing the story together. "But Max didn't give up," he said, more to himself than to the Harpers. "He must have followed them." Sarah looked at Max, her expression filled with a mix of awe and sorrow. "That's the only explanation," she said. "Max must have followed whoever took Alice. He must have been tracking her this whole time." Clark crouched down beside Max, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" he said softly. Max's tail thumped weakly against the floor, but his eyes remained on Alice, as if to say, "I was just doing my job." "But how did he find the police station?" Michael asked, his brow furrowed. "How did he know to go there?" Clark thought for a moment, his gaze drifting to the doll in Alice's hands. "The doll," he said. "He brought it with him. It must have been Alice's." Sarah nodded, her hand brushing over the doll's faded yellow dress. "It is. She's had it since she was a baby. She never went anywhere without it." Clark's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. "Max must have found the doll wherever Alice was being held," he said. "Maybe it was left behind, or maybe Alice dropped it on purpose. Either way, Max knew it was important. He carried it with him like a clue, and somehow he found his way to us." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "He's incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "After everything he went through, he still didn't give up." Clark nodded, his hand still resting on Max's head. "Dogs like Max, they're more than just pets, they're family, and sometimes they're heroes." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Max's journey sinking in. The old dog had endured so much, injury, hunger, exhaustion, all to protect the little girl he loved. His loyalty and determination had led him across miles of unknown terrain, through danger and hardship, to the one place where he knew he could get help. And in the end, he had succeeded. As Clark stood, he looked at the Harpers, his expression serious. "Max saved Alice's life," he said. "There's no doubt about that. But he's not just a hero, he's a survivor, and he deserves to be with the people he loves." Sarah knelt down beside Max, her hand gently stroking his fur. "He's always been part of our family," she said, her voice trembling. "And he always will be." Alice, who had been quiet until now, reached out and placed her small hand on Max's head. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog's tail wagged slightly, and for the first time since they found him, he closed his eyes, his body relaxing completely. He was home. As Clark watched the scene unfold, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Max's story was one of resilience, loyalty, and love, a reminder of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. And though the scars of their ordeal would take time to heal, one thing was certain: Max and Alice had found their way back to each other, and nothing would ever separate them again. The investigation into the warehouse had barely begun when Officer Clark realized the horrifying truth. This was no isolated incident. The evidence collected at the scene, documents, photographs, and the testimonies of the suspects in custody, pointed to something much larger, a sprawling network of human trafficking that extended far beyond the city. The warehouse was just one piece of a much darker puzzle. Clark sat in the precinct's conference room, surrounded by his team. The table was covered in files, maps, and photographs, each one a grim reminder of the lives that had been stolen and exploited. The air was heavy with tension as the officers reviewed the evidence, their faces grim. "This isn't just a local operation," Clark said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "The passports we found, some of them are from other countries, and the suspects we've arrested, they're not talking, but the little we've gotten out of them suggests they're just low-level players. Someone else is pulling the strings." Detective Ramirez, one of Clark's most trusted colleagues, nodded. "We've already flagged the case with the federal authorities. They're sending in a task force to help us, but this is going to take time. Whoever's behind this, they've been careful. They've covered their tracks." Clark leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Every moment they spent chasing leads was another moment that more children could be taken, more lives destroyed. He glanced down at the photograph in his hand, a picture of Alice Harper, taken just after her rescue. She was smiling, her arms wrapped tightly around Max. The image was a reminder of why they were fighting so hard. They had saved Alice, but there were so many others who still needed help. As if sensing Clark's thoughts, Max let out a soft bark from where he was lying near the door. The old German Shepherd had become a fixture at the precinct in the days following the rescue. Despite his age and the toll the ordeal had taken on his body, Max seemed to have a renewed sense of purpose. He followed Clark everywhere, his presence a source of comfort and inspiration for the entire team. Clark smiled faintly and reached down to scratch behind Max's ears. "You're not done yet, are you, buddy?" he said softly. Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright with determination. The team spent the next several days poring over the evidence, following every lead they could find. The documents recovered from the warehouse provided a starting point, names, locations, and financial records that hinted at the scope of the operation. But it wasn't enough. The network was vast and well organized, with layers of secrecy designed to protect those at the top. Clark and his team worked tirelessly, coordinating with federal agencies and international organizations to track the flow of money and people. They uncovered safe houses, transport routes, and front businesses used to launder money. Each discovery brought them closer to the heart of the operation, but it also revealed just how far the network reached. One night, as Clark sat at his desk reviewing a particularly complex set of financial records, Max approached him, nudging his hand with his nose. Clark looked down, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What is it, Max?" he asked. The dog barked softly and trotted toward the door, his tail wagging. Clark followed him, curious. Max led him to the evidence room where one of the officers was cataloging items recovered from the warehouse. The officer looked up as Clark entered, a puzzled expression on his face. "Something wrong, Clark?" the officer asked. Clark shook his head. "Not sure, Max seems to think there's something here we need to see. Max sniffed around the room, his nose leading him to a box of documents. He pawed at it, letting out a low whine. Clark crouched down and opened the box, his eyes scanning the contents. Most of it was paperwork they had already reviewed, passports, shipping manifests, and other records. But then he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small notebook, its cover worn and faded. Clark opened the notebook, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. It was filled with handwritten notes, names, and addresses, many of them coded. But one name stood out, written in bold letters on the first page: the broker. "Who's the broker?" Clark muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The officer leaned over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen that name before," he said. "It came up in one of the interviews with the suspects. They mentioned the broker as the person who coordinates everything, moving the kids, paying off the right people, keeping the operation running." Clark's grip on the notebook tightened. "If we can find the broker, we can take down the whole network." The discovery of the notebook marked a turning point in the investigation. With the help of federal and international agencies, Clark's team began to piece together the identity of the broker. It wasn't easy. The person behind the name had gone to great lengths to remain anonymous. But slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Max continued to play a surprising role in the investigation. Despite his age, the dog's instincts were sharper than ever. He seemed to have a knack for finding things others overlooked, whether it was a hidden compartment in a suspect's car or a discarded piece of evidence at a crime scene. Clark often joked that Max was the best detective on the team, but there was truth in his words. The dog's presence was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded. Clark and his team traveled across the country, following leads and coordinating with law enforcement agencies in other cities. They uncovered more warehouses, rescued more children, and arrested dozens of suspects. Each victory brought them closer to dismantling the network, but it also revealed the true scale of the operation. One night, as Clark sat in a hotel room reviewing the latest reports, Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. Clark reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, his mind heavy with the weight of the case. "We're getting closer, Max," he said quietly, "but it's not enough. We need to find the broker." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging slightly. Clark smiled faintly, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The dog's unwavering determination was contagious, a reminder that they couldn't give up. Finally, after months of relentless work, the breakthrough came. A tip from an informant led them to a remote villa in a foreign country, where the broker was believed to be hiding. Clark and a team of international agents coordinated a raid, storming the villa in the early hours of the morning. The operation was swift and precise, and by the end of it, the broker was in custody. The arrest marked the end of the network's reign of terror. With the broker's cooperation, law enforcement agencies around the world were able to dismantle the remaining pieces of the operation, rescuing countless victims and bringing the perpetrators to justice. Back at the precinct, Clark stood in the conference room looking at the board where they had mapped out the network. It was over. The children were safe, and the people responsible were behind bars. But as he looked down at Max, who was lying at his feet, he knew the real hero of the story. "You did it, Max," Clark said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you." Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright with pride. The old German shepherd had proven that age was no barrier to courage, and his loyalty and determination had inspired everyone around him. He wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward. The night was dark and heavy with tension as Officer Clark and his team approached the second warehouse. The investigation had led them here, to what they believed was a critical transit point in the human trafficking network they had been working tirelessly to dismantle. The location was remote, surrounded by overgrown fields and abandoned industrial buildings, the perfect place for criminals to operate in secrecy. But tonight, secrecy would no longer protect them. Clark stood near the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the warehouse in the distance. The building was larger than the first one they had raided, its windows boarded up, and its exterior cloaked in shadows. The faint hum of machinery could be heard from inside, a sign that the operation was still active. Clark's grip tightened on his flashlight as he turned to his team. "All right," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got confirmation that this is a transit point. There could be victims inside, so we move carefully. No mistakes. We get them out, and we take these bastards down. The officers nodded, their faces set with determination. Max, the old German shepherd who had become an integral part of the team, stood at Clark's side, his ears perked and his body tense. Despite his age, Max's instincts were as sharp as ever, and Clark knew they would need him tonight. The team moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath them. They approached the warehouse from multiple angles, their flashlights off to avoid detection. Clark's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the main entrance, a large metal door that was slightly ajar. He signaled for the team to stop, his hand raised in a silent command. Max sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he picked up a scent. He let out a low growl, his body stiffening. Clark crouched down beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max didn't respond, his focus entirely on the door. Clark nodded to the officers behind him, signaling them to prepare for entry. With a swift motion, one of the officers pushed the door open, and the team moved inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of crates, machinery, and narrow corridors. The air was thick with the smell of oil and damp wood, and the faint sound of voices echoed from somewhere deeper inside. Clark's flashlight swept over the room, revealing signs of recent activity, discarded food containers, clothing, and other personal items that suggested people had been here recently. "Spread out," Clark whispered. "Search every corner. Look for anything suspicious." The team fanned out, their movements careful and deliberate. Max stayed close to Clark, his nose to the ground as he sniffed for clues. The dog's behavior was sharper than usual, his body language tense and alert. Clark could feel the urgency radiating from him, as if Max knew they were running out of time. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Max suddenly stopped, his ears pricking up. He let out a sharp bark, his tail wagging furiously as he pawed at the ground near a stack of crates. Clark knelt down beside him, his flashlight illuminating the area. At first he didn't see anything unusual, but then he noticed a faint seam in the floor, a hidden trapdoor. "Over here!" Clark called out, his voice urgent. The other officers rushed to his side, their flashlights converging on the spot. Together, they moved the crates aside, revealing the trapdoor in its entirety. It was made of heavy wood, with a metal handle that was partially rusted. Clark grabbed the handle and pulled, the door creaking loudly as it opened. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air below cold and damp. Max barked again, his body leaning forward as if urging them to move quickly. "Let's go," Clark said, his voice firm. He led the way down the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The staircase was steep and narrow, the walls lined with concrete that was slick with moisture. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the confined space, each step bringing them closer to whatever lay below. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The air was colder here, and the faint sound of voices grew louder. Clark's heart raced as he moved forward, his flashlight revealing a series of doors on either side of the corridor. Some were open, revealing empty rooms filled with discarded furniture and debris. Others were locked, their heavy metal frames rusted and imposing. Max stopped in front of one of the locked doors, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom. He barked sharply, his tail wagging as he pawed at the door. Clark crouched down beside him, his flashlight illuminating the door's surface. He could hear faint sounds coming from the other side, soft cries and muffled voices. "There are people in there," Clark said, his voice urgent. "Get this door open, now." One of the officers stepped forward with a crowbar, wedging it into the doorframe and using all his strength to pry it open. The metal groaned in protest, but after a few moments the door gave way, swinging open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. Inside, a group of children huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They were dirty and malnourished, their clothes tattered and their bodies trembling. The sight was both heartbreaking and infuriating, a stark reminder of the cruelty they were fighting against. "It's okay," Clark said gently, stepping into the room. "You're safe now. We're here to help." The children hesitated at first, their fear keeping them frozen in place. But then Max stepped forward, his tail wagging and his body language calm and reassuring. One of the younger children, a boy no older than 5, reached out hesitantly, his small hand brushing against Max's fur. The dog licked his hand gently, and the boy's face softened, his fear giving way to a tentative smile. The other children began to move, their trust in Max giving them the courage to step forward. Clark and the other officers helped them out of the room, wrapping them in blankets and offering them water. The children clung to the officers, their small hands gripping tightly as they were led to safety. As the team worked to evacuate the children, Clark turned his attention to the rest of the corridor. There were more doors, more rooms that needed to be searched. He signaled for the team to keep moving, his determination renewed. Max continued to lead the way, his instincts guiding them to hidden rooms and passageways. Each discovery brought more victims to safety and uncovered more evidence of the network's operations. By the time the raid was over, they had rescued over a dozen children and arrested several key members of the trafficking ring. As the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the warehouse, Clark stood outside, watching as the children were loaded into ambulances. Max sat beside him, his body tired but his eyes bright with determination. The old German shepherd had once again proven his worth, his courage and loyalty shining through in the face of danger. "You did good, Max," Clark said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you." Max wagged his tail, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won another battle. And as long as Max was by his side, Clark knew they would keep fighting, no matter how long it took. Together, they would bring justice to those who had been wronged and ensure that no one else would have to suffer in silence. The Harper family home was filled with warmth and light as the winter sun streamed through the windows. It had been weeks since Alice had been rescued, and though the scars of her ordeal were still fresh, the house was slowly returning to a sense of normalcy. Laughter could be heard again, and the once quiet rooms were now alive with the sounds of a little girl rediscovering her world. But there was one new addition to the household that had changed everything: Max. The old German shepherd had become a permanent member of the Harper family. After everything he had done to save Alice, there was no question in Sarah and Michael Harper's minds that Max belonged with them. He wasn't just a dog. He was a hero, a protector, and a symbol of hope. For Alice, Max was much more than that. He was her guardian angel, her constant companion, and her source of comfort as she began to heal. It had been Alice's idea to officially adopt Max. The day after she returned home, she had clung to him, refusing to let him out of her sight. "He saved me," she had told her parents, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's my best friend. We can't let him go." Sarah and Michael had exchanged a glance, their hearts breaking at the sight of their daughter's tearful plea. They had already been considering it, but hearing Alice's words made the decision easy. Max was family now, and he always would be. Max adjusted quickly to his new life with the Harpers. Though he was older and his body showed signs of the hardships he had endured, his spirit was as strong as ever. He followed Alice everywhere, his watchful eyes always on her. Whether she was playing in the backyard, reading in her room, or sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures, Max was never far away. He seemed to sense when she needed him most, nudging her gently with his nose or resting his head on her lap when she was feeling sad or scared. The nights were the hardest for Alice. The trauma of her kidnapping had left her with vivid nightmares that often woke her in the middle of the night, her small body trembling with fear. But Max was always there. He would climb onto her bed, his warm body pressed against hers, and let out a soft, reassuring whine. His presence calmed her, grounding her in the safety of her home. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade, replaced by the comfort of knowing Max was there to protect her. One night, as Sarah peeked into Alice's room to check on her, she found her daughter fast asleep, her arms wrapped around Max like a stuffed animal. The dog's eyes opened briefly, meeting Sarah's gaze, and she could have sworn there was a look of understanding in them. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Max wasn't just helping Alice heal, he was helping the entire family. Word of Max's heroism spread quickly throughout the community. The story of how he had tracked Alice, led the police to the warehouse, and helped rescue the children captured the hearts of everyone who heard it. Local newspapers ran articles about him, calling him the hero dog, and news stations featured segments about his incredible bravery and loyalty. People from all over the town sent letters, gifts, and even donations to the Harpers, wanting to show their support. One day, a reporter came to the Harper home to interview the family for a feature story. Alice, shy but proud, sat on the couch with Max by her side, her hand resting on his fur. She told the reporter about how Max had always been her best friend, how he had tried to protect her when she was taken, and how he had never given up on her. "Max is my hero," she said simply, her voice filled with love. "He saved me." The story went viral, spreading far beyond their small town. People from across the country, and even around the world, were inspired by Max's loyalty and courage. He became a symbol of hope, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Schools used his story to teach children about bravery and kindness, and animal shelters saw an increase in adoptions as people were moved to give other dogs a chance to be heroes in their own way. Despite the attention, life at the Harper home remained simple and focused on healing. Alice continued to see a therapist to help her process the trauma she had experienced, and Max was often included in the sessions. The therapist noted how much calmer and more open Alice was when Max was with her, and she encouraged the Harpers to let him be part of her recovery. One afternoon, as Alice sat on the living room floor drawing pictures, Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. She was working on a picture of the two of them, her small hands carefully coloring in Max's fur. When she finished, she held it up proudly for her parents to see. "It's me and Max," she said with a smile. "We're best friends forever." Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance, their eyes misty with emotion. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to hug her daughter. "Just like you and Max." As the months passed, Max's age began to catch up with him. His movements grew slower, and he spent more time resting, but his spirit never wavered. He still followed Alice everywhere, his loyalty as strong as ever. The Harpers made sure he was comfortable, giving him a soft bed to sleep on and plenty of love and attention. One sunny afternoon, Alice and Max were sitting in the backyard, watching the clouds drift by. Alice leaned against him, her hand gently stroking his fur. "You're the best dog in the whole world," she said softly. "I love you, Max." Max let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging weakly. In that moment, it was clear that he felt the same way. The story of Max and Alice continued to inspire people long after the events that had brought them together. Schools, community centers, and even animal rescue organizations used their story as an example of the power of love, loyalty, and resilience. The Harpers often received letters from people who had been touched by Max's bravery, sharing how his story had given them hope during difficult times. One day, the Harpers were invited to a local event honoring Max as a community hero. The town had organized a special ceremony to recognize his contributions, and people from all over came to celebrate him. Alice stood proudly on the stage with Max by her side, her hand resting on his back as the mayor presented them with a plaque. "Max has shown us all what it means to be brave, loyal, and selfless," the mayor said. "He reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. Thank you, Max, for being a hero to us all." The crowd erupted into applause, and Alice leaned down to hug Max tightly. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice filled with love. As the years went by, Max remained a cherished member of the Harper family. Though his body grew weaker with age, his spirit never faded. He continued to watch over Alice, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. And when the time finally came for him to rest, he was surrounded by the family who loved him more than words could express. Max's legacy lived on, not just in the hearts of the Harpers, but in the countless lives he had touched. His story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable challenges, love and loyalty could overcome anything. And for Alice, Max would always be her guardian angel, the dog who had saved her life and taught her the true meaning of friendship. The story of Max, the old German shepherd who had saved Alice Harper and helped dismantle a human trafficking network, became a legend in the small town. It was a tale that transcended time, passed down from one generation to the next, growing in meaning and significance with each retelling. Max was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and hope, a reminder of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. In the years following the events that had made Max a hero, the town embraced his story as part of its identity. A mural was painted on the side of the local community center, depicting Max standing proudly with Alice by his side. The image captured the essence of their bond, a brave, loyal dog and the little girl he had saved. Beneath the mural, a plaque read, "In honor of Max, the hero who taught us the power of love, loyalty, and courage. May his story inspire us all to be better, braver, and kinder." The mural became a beloved landmark, a place where people would gather to reflect on Max's legacy. Children would stop to point at the painting, their eyes wide with wonder as their parents told them the story of the dog who had never given up. Schools incorporated Max's story into their lessons, using it to teach students about bravery, compassion, and the importance of standing up for what is right. For Officer Clark, Max's story was deeply personal. After retiring from the police force, Clark found himself reflecting often on the events that had brought Max into his life. The old dog had not only helped save Alice, but it also reminded Clark of why he had become a police officer in the first place, to protect the innocent and fight for justice. Max had reignited that sense of purpose in him, and for that, Clark would always be grateful. Even in retirement, Clark remained close to the Harper family. He visited their home regularly, bringing treats for Max and spending hours talking with Alice and her parents. Over time, Clark became like an honorary member of the family, his bond with Max and Alice growing stronger with each visit. On one such visit, Clark sat on the porch with Max lying at his feet. The dog was older now, his muzzle graying and his movements slower, but his eyes still held the same spark of intelligence and loyalty that had made him a hero. Clark reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, a soft smile on his face. "You've done more in your life than most people ever will," Clark said quietly. "You've saved lives, brought families back together, and inspired an entire town. You're a legend, Max." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging weakly. It was as if he understood every word, his quiet strength and humility shining through even in his old age. The Harper family cherished every moment they had with Max. Alice, now a teenager, remained as close to him as ever. She often sat with him in the backyard, reading aloud from her favorite books or simply talking to him about her day. Max would listen attentively, his head resting on her lap, his presence a constant source of comfort and reassurance. As Alice grew older, she began to understand the full extent of what Max had done for her. She realized that his actions had not only saved her life, but had also shaped the person she was becoming. His courage and loyalty were qualities she aspired to embody, and she often found herself asking, what would Max do when faced with difficult decisions? One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Alice brought out a scrapbook she had been working on. It was filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes about Max's life and the impact he had made. "I want to make sure we never forget him," Alice said, her voice filled with emotion. "I want everyone to know how special he is." Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance, their eyes misty with pride. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," Sarah said. "Max deserves to be remembered." As the years passed, Max's health began to decline. The once energetic dog who had chased down criminals and uncovered hidden passageways now spent most of his days resting in the sun, his body tired, but his spirit unbroken. The Harpers did everything they could to make him comfortable, showering him with love and care. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned shades of gold and red, Max passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was surrounded by his family, his final moments filled with the love and warmth of the people who had become his world. Alice held him close, her tears falling onto his fur as she whispered, "Thank you, Max, for everything." The town mourned the loss of their hero. News of Max's passing spread quickly, and people from all over came to pay their respects. The Harpers held a small ceremony in their backyard where Max had spent so many happy days. Clark gave a heartfelt speech, his voice breaking as he spoke about the dog who had changed all their lives. "Max wasn't just a dog," Clark said, his eyes glistening with tears. "He was a hero, a friend, and a reminder of what it means to be truly selfless. He taught us that even in the darkest times there is always hope. And though he may be gone, his legacy will live on in all of us." In the years that followed, Max's story continued to inspire. The town established an annual Max Day, a celebration of loyalty and courage where people would gather to share stories, honor local heroes, and raise funds for animal shelters. The event became a beloved tradition, a way to keep Max's memory alive and ensure that his legacy would never be forgotten. Alice, now an adult, carried Max's lessons with her wherever she went. She pursued a career in social work, dedicating her life to helping children who had experienced trauma. Whenever she faced challenges, she thought of Max and the strength he had shown in the face of adversity. His memory gave her the courage to keep going, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One day, as Alice walked through the town square, she stopped in front of the mural of Max. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "You're still with me, Max," she whispered. "You always will be." Max's story became more than just a tale of a brave dog. It became a symbol of the best parts of humanity. His loyalty, courage, and unwavering love reminded people of what truly mattered in life. And though he was no longer physically present, his spirit lived on in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by his story. For the Harper family, Max would always be more than a legend. He was their protector, their friend, and their hero. And as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the town that had embraced his legacy, they knew that Max's impact would never fade. He had left behind a world that was better, kinder, and braver because of him. A world where his story would continue to inspire for generations to come.